Hello and welcome. You're listening to the SPAG Dialogue podcast.
Hello, everyone. I am Neha Chandra, Healthcare Communications Specialist with SPAG, and today I'm in conversation with Apurupa Vatsalya, who's a sexuality educator and founder of Bibliotherapy, a mental health book club regarded as a safe space for healing through reading and psychoeducation. Also joining us is Farah Manekshaw. Farah is a therapist at Ummeed Child Development Center, where she works with disabled and neurodivergent children, as well as their families. Additionally, she has her own private practice where she works with queer and neurodivergent adults. She also freelances as a journalist and writes about subjects related to mental health from a socio-political lens. So, on account of World Mental Health Day, we are here to understand how coming to terms with one's gender identity and sexual orientation has an impact on one's mental health and of those around them. For the Indian LGBTQIA community, there is a constant conflict between one's internal reality regarding gender and then trying to fit in what the world deems as normal and acceptable. This can be highly distressful and have an adverse impact on one's mental health. So, jumping on to the first question, Apurupa, through your Instagram page, you talk about various facets of sexuality and mental health. Tell us a bit about your mental health journey and coming to terms with your identity.
Thank you for this question, Neha, because my page and my project also comes from a deeply personal space, which is why, unlike other educators, you do see me share a lot about my life and my experiences. I think the page was almost created as a resource to myself while I came to terms with my own identity and while I navigated my mental health journey. About 5 years ago, I'd say, was when I was diagnosed with depression and anxiety. And I've been in therapy and have been taking medication ever since. And just last year, I received my autism diagnosis. Although I don't place it in the same category as depression or anxiety, I just feel like neurodivergence is another way of being. It does present with quite a few challenges in a deeply ableist world. Also, other facets of my identity, such as my queerness, my political identity, my womanhood, and so on, are all not even in the top three markers of my own identity, right? And I think that is the beauty of exploring and discovering who you really are. If you were to ask me who I am, who Apurupa is, I wouldn't even identify with all these things that form such a definitive part of my identity as something that I really identify on a day-to-day basis. I'd say I'm a cat lover. I'd say I'm obsessed with the smell of books, trying not to drink alcohol because it interferes with my medicine, and so on and so forth. So I think that's really the aim of my Instagram project as well, which is to humanize folks and to also find a space where I'm beyond all these things, where I'm all these things, of course, but I'm also beyond, in between, and so much more. So I think it's just a space. It's almost like a personal journal for me. I think each week I sort of figure out what topic I'm interested in, and I use that platform to explore them.
I think, I really like the fact that you said that there's so much to a person. And that's really something that I get, that you're bringing out through your response. And, Farah, the same question for you. You're a practicing therapist and you're part of the queer community. So how was it for you to communicate about your identity, first with yourself and then with your people?
So I think for me, I actually figured out about my sexuality a lot earlier than I was a therapist. I figured it out quite early in my teenage years. And I think for me, coming into my queerness, so generally there's this narrative that figuring out your queerness or coming out has to be about a lot of suffering. It has to be about a lot of shame and secrecy. And of course, that does exist because you're living in such a queer negative environment. But there are also other narratives. And I think we don't talk about queer joy enough. And for me, that it was that other narrative where I felt like the label of being bisexual brought a lot of congruence for me. It brought a lot of ease. And it was almost like coming home. And lately, I think I identify with it even more strongly because it's a very political decision, given how systemic bi-erasure and biphobia is adversely affecting the mental health of bisexuals really badly. And that being said, it does come with a lot of privilege that I had such a wonderful experience coming out, or because I knew that I had safe spaces to explore, or I had the knowledge that there was nothing wrong with being bisexual, or that there wouldn't be any violence were I to claim this identity for myself. And in terms of people and sharing my identity with people, I felt like the process of finding myself, or the process of figuring out my identity, happened through people as well. Like, it happened relationally, like it was through conversations, it was through questioning, and college was a very safe space for me to figure these things out.
And Farah, you just said that you came to terms with your identity when you were in your teen years. So, somewhere we feel that the information or understanding yourself, somewhere we need to start from ground zero. So when I say ground zero, I mean at the school level. And for each kid to get that opportunity to understand themselves in that environment that needs to be created, which we understand that now at this moment probably it is not there. You work with Ummeed, so you work with children. And how do we really inculcate that culture where we address these gender stereotypes, create an inclusive culture at the very base level, at the school level?
This is a really difficult question to answer in briefly, but I try to do my best because there's so much to cover. I feel like curriculum is one aspect of it, but then there's also workshops and sensitizations. There's also the kind of infrastructure that you have in the school, and then perhaps we can also talk about the kind of culture that's there, that we can foster for queer inclusivity. So when it comes to curriculum, there's a lot of erasure of not only of queerness, but also of other marginalized identities. So if you look at your history, so queerness was and has always been a big part of Indian culture. That's something that's erased, or the fact that the Hijra community has been around for centuries, and that's something that just isn't a part of our syllabus. And then similarly, like for other identities as well, we never learn about Dalit history, and then moving to like other subjects as well that would need a radical overhaul of. Would be your literature, whether you look at when you look at queer authors, do we also look at the queer subtext in some of their plays and in some of their writing? Or for biology, is it being taught in a very binary, very heterosexual way? Or is there a difference that you're trying to bring in the curriculum? So in that way, the syllabus would need to be far more intersectional than it currently is. And when it comes to workshops and sensitizations and things like that, like of course I don't think one sex education workshop is enough. I think it would need to be an ongoing conversation, and with all the stakeholders involved, not just children, but also parents, also staff, also teachers. As I mentioned, infrastructurally, you might want to look at gender neutral washrooms. You might want to look at the kind of uniforms that the school has and whether it's affirming for all the children, whether the kind of intake forms that you have or the kind of administrative paperwork, whether there's just male and female or whether we're making space for other identities, whether your library has resources on sex education that are inclusive, whether there's queer literature that you're intentionally making space for. Or I'm also thinking about affirmative action and hiring queer and trans people, because that is how you're going to change overhaul the entire system and make it more inclusive. And then once you have all these changes in place, that's when your culture actually starts to become queer inclusive, because there are teachers who are sensitized or teachers who are queer themselves, and then the language the teachers use might not be as binary, or the ways in which they address bullying may also start to change. So when there's queer negative bullying and harassment, how do you ensure that the young person who's experiencing the bullying is safe, but also how do you address the bully's needs, and how do you provide for what efforts are you doing for rehabilitation there? How are you unpacking these queer negative ideas with them and with other people in their class? And of course, mental health support that's queer affirmative.
I think clearly, when you started responding, definitely said there's so much, under this one question that needs to be addressed. And, the fact that this is a conversation that we've asked now, but it's something that really needs to be addressed. And this is something we'll keep on sort of talking about. It's a conversation that keeps on evolving. I think where we need to start is to first be open and understand that there is something that needs to be done here. So when I was, researching, we found out these international reports that say that LGBTQ persons are thrice as likely to experience a mental health condition because of, the fact that they're bullied in school, there's rejection, there's workplace discrimination. But in the Indian context, there was very less data. In fact, next to nothing that I was able to find. So this is where I wanted to, I want to ask Apurupa that how do you think we need to first address the fact that there is not enough data, not enough is being talked about?
I'd say conversations, and what you're doing right now is a great example of that, right? You need to invite more queer and trans folks into the conversations, not take up space. And the way I like to describe it is pass the mic, but don't leave the room, because we do need your allyship and we do need you to use your privilege, use the voice that you already have, essentially enforce almost these anti-discrimination policies, not just at a formal level, but also in informal settings. And as Farah was speaking, I was so inspired, and I had goosebumps. And I also want to use this opportunity to talk to our audience about how cis heteropatriarchy doesn't just harm women, doesn't just harm queer folks, doesn't just harm folks of a particular identity. It causes harm to everybody. These are violent structures. And in fact, queer and trans individuals actually give you the gift of challenging what your identity means and whether you have internalized some of these scripts of what it is supposed to look like, these roles, these gender roles, and these sexual identities that we play. So I think research dearth is a very real thing, and it's not just even as a woman, I find that for a lot of, like, for instance, I live with PMDD, and there isn't enough research on PMDD. There isn't, and I didn't know whom to go to for a diagnosis, in fact. So very important for us to have researchers and listen to lived experiences. I've been having a very interesting conversation with this psychiatrist on Instagram. She DM'd me saying how, you can't call yourself autistic, autism is a disorder, so on and so forth. And I was trying to explain to her how it's my lived experience, and I can choose to process it, and I can choose to label it in a manner and form that is meaningful to me. And she just refused to back down, and that's another conversation, of course. But really what I'm getting at is it doesn't always have to be numbers. It can also be a story that a person tells you, and that is meaningful, and that is research.
So definitely a combination of facts, figures, and when you say facts, we have numbers and we have stories. So, just while listening to all this, I feel like we cannot stress the importance of having a strong support system and a sense of community at this time of exploring yourself, to actually give room to focus on mental health. So Apurupa, you co-founded a book club, Bibliotherapy. And as I've seen and read about it, it's a non-judgmental space conducive to mental health. So what really went into starting a club like that? And, what was your thought process when you decided to co-found this club?
I think, Neha, when I started the book club, I was very naive in calling it a safe space. And I was very naive in calling it, a non-judgmental, inclusive space. And you hear these words being thrown around. They are buzzwords. I'm glad that spaces are actively at least attempting to become more and more safe. But having said that, it's a practice, right? You don't just get to call yourself a safe space and that's that. What happens when a conflict arises? What happens when someone feels unsafe? What happens when someone thinks you are the perpetrator? I think those are conversations that need to be had as well. I think the reason why I started the book club, which is very similar to the reason why I start most things, I'm interested to learn something, so I might as well invite a community of folks who are interested in similar conversations, similar explorations. That's really came from a very, very selfish space where I wanted to read more. I was also curious about, self-help books and the whole genre at that point. Yeah, and I found a friend who wanted to do something similar, and that's really where it came from. But of course, it grew into something more, right? We did a bunch of courses around body neutrality. We spoke about hope, in the light of our current political situation. So I think you also need to allow for it to become what it needs to become when the community starts to interact with it. and not be selfish and not be stuck up on what it is supposed to mean. So yeah, it came from a very selfish space, and I will freely admit that. But I think I'm glad that I did that, and I'm glad that a lot of queer and trans folks found it to be a safe space and found it to be a space where they felt heard and they felt represented. So I mean this entire conversation has been a lot about what can communities do, what can individuals do, and it's been very interesting to engage in it. But I'm also, so when you talk about families, and Neha, this is something that I said I would bring up in our conversation as well. And when you said, communities, it's also very important for us to acknowledge the importance of, chosen families. And as queer and trans folks, often we don't have that kind of connection with our natal families, and we don't feel safe with them. We don't feel like we can be authentic with them. So, and Farah also brought up queer joy and queer camaraderie. So, I just also want to, use this opportunity to give a big shout out to all the chosen families out there, and all folks who've, found each other and loved each other and have taken care of each other in the light of, the law not necessarily recognizing us as a family. So yeah, that's my tuppence on why I started a book club.
You've said that it was for selfish reasons that you started, but it was something you felt strongly about. And to actually find people who feel the same way or who also get that space to express themselves, I think that's what that club intentionally, unintentionally came out to be. And now that you've brought in this topic about chosen family, I really, want to ask Farah, and now we're nearing the end of today's episode, but Farah, I really want to know your thoughts on the importance of support from the family that biological, your chosen family, that kind of importance from your family and your peer group. And just want you to actually tell us a little bit about your support system and how they played this crucial role in supporting your mental health.
I was nodding vigorously while Apurupa was talking about how biological family or family of origin can be a site of violence for a lot of queer people. And while I've heard that in the post-Section 377 era, there has been a slight shift, it still remains to be a space of violence for a lot of queer and trans people. So I think queerness is a particularly isolating form of marginalization. Queerness and because neurodivergence has come up as well, because so with other forms of marginalization, like if we're talking about being born a Muslim, you do have your family around you as that support system that is also experiencing the same oppression. But with queerness, neurodivergence, or the disability, very often your family also can be oppressive, and it can be particularly isolating. And I'm thinking about people who are not quite as privileged, or maybe people in remote areas where you may not have ever met another queer person before, or maybe you don't even have the language to speak of your experience of same gender attraction or dysphoria. Yeah, and in that, and that's why peer support, and that's why community becomes all the more important for queer and trans people. And I think community tends to counter that isolation and counter that aloneness, and become a source of hope and resource for queer people. But at the same time, there's that complexity. And I think Apurupa was also talking about safe spaces. And I think not all identities may feel entirely safe within the queer community as well. That being said, I do have my own small queer community. It's like a very strong support system of queer friends. And sometimes it feels like we are creating a small queer world in which we exist together. And it's been so important for my mental health. And there's been so much dialogue about queer politics, queer literature, queer media. And it's been really beautiful. And sometimes we tend to forget that straight people even exist.
I think this is, something really beautiful that you've expressed here. And I really hope that, we create that culture, or if we're already towards that, we're in, walking that path, and we're able to create that culture. And, on this note, I really want to thank the both of you for joining the SPAG Dialogue podcast and for participating in this much needed discussion on coming to terms with one's sexual identity and the impact it has on one's mental health. For all our listeners, this was Apurupa and Farah, and I'm Neha Chandra, and you're listening to SPAG Dialogue.
Thank you for listening. If you'd like to tune in to more such conversations, subscribe to the SPAG Dialogue podcast or visit our website spagdialogue.com.